urgent action for migration rights. Before we get started, I just want to turn things over to my colleague Micah McCall-Nicholson for a moment, and she will share some information about how we are going to be gathering and the technology considerations.
Hi, friends. As Alyssa mentioned, I'm Micah McCall-Nicholson. I serve Friends as the Program Associate for Quaker Engagement, and I'll be running technology for this event. So as we're gathering on this virtual platform, part of my job is to make sure that everything runs as smoothly as possible, that everyone's able to engage in the program as much as possible. So as I mentioned when folks were joining, please say hello in the chat. Feel free to share name, location, and any meeting or church that you're a part of. This is just a way that we love to build community, as Alicia mentioned, and that's such an important part of the work that we do. Additionally, as you can see, we are recording this event speaker portions, but we want to let you know that the audience will not be included in this recording for privacy reasons. So if you feel like having your camera on, if you feel like you don't and want to turn it off, do whatever feels comfortable to you. In addition, captioning is available automatically, but if you don't want to see the captions and you really just want to listen with your ears, you can click the live transcript option in your Zoom toolbar and click hide subtitles. We will be having a question and answer segment following the initial conversation between Linnea and Anika and Alicia. So throughout the program, feel free to put questions into the chat, and Alicia during that segment will offer those questions up to our speakers. We will do our best to address all of the questions that folks put in the chat. We also had questions come in through registration, so we definitely won't be able to address all of the questions, but still feel free to put them in and we'll try and get to as many of them as we can. Additionally, I see that we have some phone participants. So if you're calling in and need assistance with some of the differences with phone participation, then computer participation, feel free to message me via the Zoom chat or email me at mnicholson@fcnl.org with whatever tech assistance you need. But other than that, sending blessings to our speakers and all those in attendance. I'll push it back to you, Alicia.
Thank you, Micah. So as we start our conversation, I want to invite you to just take a moment here and settle, take a breath. There is so much happening in the world that is trying to blow us off course and distract us. And even as we are spending time with a really important and heavy and joyful sometimes topic of how we are living into our calling to be in community with our neighbors, it's important to also take time to connect to your body, the space you're in, and to share the gratitude for all the ways we're showing up. Thank you, friends. So in the questions that came in advance, I know we had some requests to get to the point. There's so much to do, and I promise you that we will do that as much as we can. There are a couple of sort of overall introductory scene setting kind of things that I do feel it is important to share as before we start the conversation with Anika and Linnea. The first is really that FCNL's work on migration and the work that we're going to be talking about is really grounded in our faith convictions. And I know that is true for many friends as well, and people of other religious identities. FCNL's version of that faith conviction is stated in the World We Seek vision statement, which many of you know, which is a vision of a world free of war and the threat of war, for a society with equity and justice for all, a community where every person's potential may be fulfilled, and an earth restored. And we deepen and particularize that vision in our Statement of Legislative Policy, which is this comprehensive document developed through the discernment of thousands of friends in hundreds of friends meetings and churches across the country. Many of you may have participated in that and then also in setting our legislative priorities. Um, and the preamble of that document says, our legislative policy rises out of the conviction that there is that of God in every person, and that all creation has worth and dignity. We speak from our faith for a new vision of how the world community can live together more peacefully and justly and with greater care for each other and our shared world. And then the document goes on to lay out the migration policies that FCNL advocates for coming out of that belief and that sense, which I'm sure we will talk some about in the questions and answers to come. The second point that I just want to raise is I know a number of you have lots and lots of questions about what you can be doing in your own community, how you can be part of some of the legal challenges to the immigration policies that are happening, and many, many other things. FCNL's role is really to lobby Congress and influence federal policy, which is a piece of this change work and connected to all of these other pieces. And, you know, and many of you have just a whole range of background and experience in working with immigrant communities that can add to the work that needs to happen. But FCNL's particular role is advocating to influence the laws and policies of the US government. So our focus tonight is really going to be on sort of how those laws and policies and the lobbying work that we do connect into some of these other efforts and where the opportunities are now for, um, you know, all these strategies to support migrants and immigrant rights and what our faith and our, it really looks like to act with integrity, and how to think about the power we have to change things and to work for change. So with that framing, I want to open up our conversation. And, I mentioned before sort of all of the efforts that are happening. And I just want to start by asking Anika, who is our lobbyist on this issue and our director of domestic policy as well, sort of how does the lobbying that FCNL is doing connect to some of the broader efforts that are being made across the country?
Thanks, Alicia, and greetings to everyone who's on the call. Thank you for taking the time to join us in this conversation and for the work that I know many of you do related to migration justice. We're witnessing a lot of really devastating impacts in our immigration system, and I use that term intentionally because the policies that have been rolling out from the 119th Congress, as well as the Trump administration, are so deeply removed from migration justice. Nothing taking place right now is connected to safety or peace or justice and humanity. Our asylum system is virtually dismantled at the moment with the reinstatement of the Remain in Mexico program, as it's known colloquially, also the migrant protection protocols, which the Trump administration had created during its first term, and then the Biden administration had rescinded it. And the policy requires asylum seekers to remain in Mexico for indefinite amount of times whilst trying to seek asylum in the US. It's been a very devastating and lethal policy with folks living in places that don't have the infrastructure to take care of them and sort of be able to meet their day-to-day needs. On top of that, we know that people have in the past been victim to exploitation by local officials and cartel groups. And so harassment, sexual assault, and even death is not uncommon underneath this policy. And the Trump administration has put it back into place. We've seen our refugee resettlement and missions program suspended, with that also being attached to refugee resettlement. And so over 200,000 people who were in the process of seeking refugee protection in the US or coming to the US are now left in limbo. There are nearly 6,000 people who were in the US who are receiving government support for their first 90 days transition, and that funding has been disrupted. And we know we've heard a lot of calls and threats related to our undocumented populations, the mass deportation, mass detention agenda. We've seen attempts to politicize this issue, to desensitize it, and to remove the humanity of our immigrant communities from the conversation. It's all rooted in weaponizing fear and concerns, but has really devastating and real impacts, and is not something that should be used as a political chess piece. We have seen reports from schools noting that children are missing classes and not coming in for days out of fear. There are reports on hospitals about people not attending and getting care that they need in emergency rooms because of fear of immigration enforcement potentially being in the area. We have heard of a middle school teacher in Florida who was detained and arrested and deported, a father of 5 in Texas who was deported with no consideration for what his family will experience afterwards. And so the implications of these policies are very real. And we see Congress wanting to issue a blank check for this cruelty, wanting to offer billions of dollars for a process that is being unchecked in terms of how it is being implemented and how detainments are occurring. We've seen citizens be detained. We've seen threats against indigenous communities. This happened in particular within Navajo Nation, but we know there have been concerns in Alaska as well for various Native communities. And so it impacts us all. And it also impacts us from the sense of we are talking about our neighbors, our colleagues, our local business owners. We saw in Atlanta, ICE attempt to detain a congregant who was at a Pentecostal service. And so we know there's also been a sense of concern around faith groups, which we would definitely unpack more throughout this conversation. And the harms for our economy are also very pertinent and deep in terms of the disruptions that we know are possible as a result of these policies. And we also know that disruptions in various industries, from agriculture and farming to construction, is also at risk here. And these policies are also tied so deeply to an agenda of militarism. So we're seeing military deployed to the border. We're seeing military flights being used, which astronomically heightens the cost of this agenda. Military bases are also in question as well, with some migrants being sent to bases that they're trying to retrofit in Colorado. We also have seen immigrants who have been sent to Guantanamo Bay. And so there's a large question as well around the use of authority that's in play by the Trump administration, how resources are being used, and if it's actually a misappropriation of funds, that a civilian conversation is being treated as if it is a war in which we need to respond to, with a lot of rhetoric around our immigrant communities being an invasion on our society. There are conversations that I think today is particularly salient, it being Day of Remembrance for Japanese Americans who experienced internment during World War II. The same legislation that allowed that to occur is something the Trump administration also seeks to resurrect, that being the Alien Enemies Act. And so we are holding in a lot of what this means. We know that it has heightened racial profiling for groups. I mentioned with indigenous communities, but a lot of these policies impact all of BIPOC communities. There was recently a local legislator in New York who's of Latino background, and in a town hall, someone questioned his citizenship status. And so the implications and ripples of this are very vast and very concerning. And we know it's going to need a lot of money to see this come into play. And so Congress has been focused on a package, something called reconciliation. It's a special vehicle that means within the Senate, it bypasses filibuster, and so only a majority vote is needed. That's particularly useful for the Republican majority, as they do have 53 members in the Senate. And so they want to use this package, one that we've seen used in the past. It was used for the Inflation Reduction Act. It was used for the Affordable Care Act. It was used for the previous Trump tax cuts. And so they want to use it in this issue to help fund that deportation, detention agenda. Initial estimates were around 88 billion dollars to or $1 million to be able to do this process. That has since drastically skyrocketed, with proposals of 175 billion within the Department of Homeland Security and 175 billion within judiciary. Some of that might overlap, but we are looking at close to around $200 billion in conversation and entertainment for this agenda. If we think about what some of that funding could be, even when it was the initial conservative estimates, that could have done over 40,000 elementary schools. It could fund a Head Start for 79 years. It could construct nearly 3 million new homes. But instead of focusing on the agenda and the needs of the people's priorities, if we will, we are seeing Congress think about cutting SNAP and Medicaid. We are seeing no sense of prioritization for living wages, for housing, for healthcare, for expanding broadband, and the list goes on. But we know our calling is about wanting to see safety and health and prosperous communities. And so a lot of our work, there's a lot going on, but it's thinking about where can we be effective right now and make an impact, and where can we channel our energy, and where do we also know that it's important for us to help lead, and where it's important for us to help support. And so when we look at something like our refugee work, that is where we are supporting. But in terms of this reconciliation and funding opportunity that the majority is seeing, we are really focused on that, and also knowing there could be an appropriations conversation. And so we're piecemealing that and thinking about what are the short-term conversations, the medium term, and the long term. And so the most immediate in terms of how we are allowing our work to be informed by what communities are experiencing and suffering and weathering on the ground is always lobbying, top and foremost, but also thinking about letters to the editors. And we have a toolkit to encourage folks to engage in there that we can share in the chat with folks. And really the conversation is, when we look at our communities and when we talk to folks and even look at polling, folks know that mass deportation and sweeping detention is not the answer. The public knows that, and I dare to say our policymakers and legislators know that, and yet they are not being willing to stand up and have a true good faith and honest conversation about how we create safe, effective, and orderly migration practices in this country. And so the masses that do believe that this is not the answer need to be heard. And so ensuring that our local narratives and airwaves and papers are hearing from people who are concerned about the policies rolling out, who are in solidarity with our immigrant communities and neighbors, who know the devastating impact that will exist if immigrants are torn from our neighborhoods and from our cities and our country, are speaking out and being overwhelmingly vocal and being clear that this cannot happen. We are also thinking about how it's important to be able to not only work as individuals, but building community support. And a lot of that is calling on and trusting our network to be those sort of folks on the ground. A lot of you are engaged in this work already and thinking about how you can channel some of that understanding and those perspectives into the conversations you are having in your communities in a more larger space, but also with your legislators. And part of that connects to a more long-term project we are thinking about in terms of a storytelling efforts. We know that proximity matters and storytelling holds weight. When we humanize people, when we think about their day-to-day experiences and their connections to us, things change and tides move. And so while I've heard stories of teachers who were apolitical and not connected to immigration issues at all, and when they see the children from their classroom no longer coming back because their families were deported, that triggers something within them that gets them operating and moving. And so that's the same thing that this storytelling project is meant to do, to bring these conversations local. And we know that faith communities have already been so important in that work. Even when groups are seemingly conservative, they know it's so important to welcome the stranger and to see that of God in everyone. And that is a lot of the work we are uplifting through these letters to the editors campaigns and storytelling campaigns in conjunction with the traditional lobbying that we know is so essential in Congress.
Thank you, Anika. We've covered a lot of facts and ground in this, and we will be in the follow-up email that we send out to everyone along with the recording. We'll share some of these links that are going into the chat, as well as some other resources on different issues. And if you have questions that you would like to make sure that we address, please make sure you put those into the chat so that we can collect those. I want to invite Linnea Halsten to join the conversation. And Linnea is our anti-racist, anti-racism, anti-biased justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion manager. So particularly thinking about the ways that that work is connected to the work that we are lifting up on immigration and migration. So Linnea, I would love to ask you, we talk a lot about integrity as a core value of Friends and of FCNL's work. What does integrity look like on this issue when there's so much happening, when there's so many fires and urgent needs and suffering? And how does that integrity inform FCNL's prophetic work as a Quaker organization doing this work? And then, and Anika, I'm sure, has a perspective on that as well. But Linnea, why don't you start?
Yeah, I was really excited about this question because I'm always thinking about what does integrity mean as the anti-racism, anti-bias, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion manager. A lot of what my work is, or that I see it is to support the organization to continue to live into its Quaker values and testimonies. And that looks like AJEDI, my acronym. And so particularly when we're thinking about the immigration or migration system, honestly, integrity is just a matter of living into Quaker testimonies to me. So integrity, equity, simplicity, community, stewardship, and peace. To me, that is really what we're talking about, is what does actually living that look like in the face of this migration system that currently is extremely inhumane and only looking to get more so. And I want to take a breath because I think what Anika shared was so true and also so much to hold. And I think there's something that is really beautiful about coming at this from a spiritual perspective or depth. I saw that we have Methodists joining us and Unitarians. I come from a Buddhist background. And this ability to hold and pause in the moment to really sit with what is actually happening right now and what would integrity call me to do in this moment can really help us ground in these moments where there's so much chaos and there's constant news, and it is so intentional to blow us off our center, to kind of negotiate, others' humanity to be, oh, that's not as bad. And so really what we can do is call on these testimonies or these values to really help us continue to stay not leaning towards the right when politics leans towards the right or leaning towards the left, but stay in our center of what is calling on us. What does it look like for us to live into these testimonies? Something that I really want us to continue to stay open to is this is an acute moment. This mass deportation, it's an acute moment of suffering that is a symptom of larger histories of oppression within the United States. And I think we all know this to some level, but I think it's really important that we continue to know that there's deeper things that need to keep shifting. This is like a flare-up of something much deeper, colonization, the construction of borders, whose land is whose. Saw people acknowledging that they're on land that often was not unceded land from Native American people in the chat when they're saying where they're coming from. And so just even thinking about, again, the origin of kind of what has happened here, racism being such a part. Anika was just sharing about the racial profiling of people being wrongly incarcerated or detained just because they appear to be of a racial group that is being targeted by mass deportation right now. then criminalization and this prison industrial complex that is happening, where privatized prisons are getting governmental deals to detain people, house people. There's a whole back industry that is connected to imprisonment and labor, and that is expanding, and that's what we're seeing right now. So it's all of this, and there's more, right? There's more that's connected to that, but I just want to name that these are bigger things that are also affecting a lot of us in different ways, and some of us are profiting from, not intentionally, but we are. And so how do we continue to hold that framework to know that there's multiple things that we need to be addressing, including this acute moment. And again, in that, how do we not replicate othering and separating? It is so easy to be saying, oh, that person, I don't even need to name that person, is so frustrating. Like if they were gone, you know, things might be so much better. And what does that look like when we're trying not to perpetuate that? And that is such a core part of the suffering that we're experiencing right now, how racism has happened in the construction of race, how this sense of who belongs and who doesn't in a country, in certain borders, who belongs in prison or who doesn't. And so what does, again, that mean for us to live in a transformational way as we're not fighting, but moving towards a better way of being with one another, and lobbying for that and advocating for that. So Quakers calling to protect the human right, dignity, and well-being of all people remains the same regardless of context. And I think that's a blessing of integrity, is it can help us not shift. I want to share a quote that I just have adored by Barbara Deming, who was a nonviolent activist. And this is from her book, Revolution and Equilibrium. You all may be familiar with it, but it to me speaks to what really integrity may call for in this moment that is also needing some resistance. So it says, with one hand, we say to one who is angry, or to an oppressor, or to an unjust system, stop what you are doing. I refuse to honor the role you are choosing to play. I refuse to obey you. I refuse to cooperate with your demands. I refuse to build the walls and the bombs. I refuse to pay for your guns. With this hand, I will even interfere with the wrong you are doing. I want to disrupt the easy pattern of your life. But then the advocate of nonviolence raises the other hand. It is raised outstretched, maybe with love and sympathy, maybe not, but always outstretched. With this hand, we say, I won't let go of you or cast you out. Maybe with love and sympathy, maybe not, but always outstretched. I have faith that you can make a better choice than you are making right now, and I'll be here when you are ready. Like it or not, we are part of one another. So this way of being, stopping and also continuing to honor the humanity of all is a huge piece of what I'm thinking integrity really looks like for Quakers right now, and something that Quakers have done really well in history. And I think many of us know that. And many of us are here because of also some of that inspiration. So yeah, I think that's kind of what I want to leave you all with, of just really being able to refuse what we know is wrong, and then also embody what we do believe is right in the same breath. I kind of want to pass it over to Anika to hear her reflections.
Thanks, and I definitely had larger thoughts to this question, but to direct response to some of what you raised, particularly when we think about the racial implications and how that's not, if we look at the existence of the U.S., this has been a centuries-long pattern. This has been centuries-long patterns, right? From when we think about conversations for citizenship for Blacks and those who were formerly enslaved, to things like the Chinese Exclusion Act, to treatment of Indigenous communities and their displacement and disposition, to when we look at even within the most recent century, during the Great Depression, at a time when the US was experiencing economic upheaval, there was a policy to deport over 1 million folks, many of whom were of Mexican descent, over 60% of whom were US citizens, right? Because often the default is to figure out how do we blame US challenges and issues and hardships on our immigrant communities. And so that's not new. We, it fast forwards to when we think about the Muslim ban and so forth. And so it is deeply entwined in our history, and it is not new. And then also just an expansion of when you were talking about profit, even though you weren't voicing it in this way, a huge and important part of the conversation around the mass detention agenda is that the US does not actually have enough facilities to detain the millions of undocumented immigrants it is talking about detaining. And so what will result, just as exists now, is that most of these places will be built by private groups and private detention centers. And so there is an element of how this helps funnel corporate greed and benefits the wealthy in this nation at the expense of working communities and families. And we cannot allow that to be lost in this conversation either. When thinking about integrity and sort of centering, I have really been encouraged a lot by just remembering the history of Quakers and social justice movements, and that Quaker conscience has routinely led to Quakers speaking truth to power, right, as Quaker and civil rights leader Bayard Rustin has said. And so even when that has put Friends on the side of being on the precarious side of government, you, in the quote you offer, you talked about resistance in sort of defying, and that has held true a lot for the norms in which Quakers have held when it is necessary. And I'm really sensitive to that conversation right now when we think about protections that used to exist for places of worship, for schools, for health provider spaces and hospitals. And so those were our sensitive locations. And it has existed informally and more so in memos from the 90s and upward, and documented more so since about 2011. And we saw in January the Trump administration repeal those protections, saying that those were not safe spaces. And immediately, many Quaker groups, Philadelphia Yearly Meeting, Baltimore Yearly Meeting, New England Yearly Meeting, Adelphi Friends and Richmond Friends, they gathered together and brought forth a litigation to challenge that under the grounds of Religious Freedom Restoration Act, under the First Amendment free exercise, and under the Administrative Procedure Act. And I got such joy looking at social media that week, which doesn't really happen, just seeing the outpouring of love. Folks were saying like, the Quakers are involved, you really messed up here. And so that level of integrity and consistency is something that I feel very encouraged by in terms of Quaker community. Last week, we saw more litigation come forth from 27 religious groups, which also included the Friends General Conference. And so that continues in the conversation. And I'm also encouraged by how we see other religious groups standing up. And so we saw about 3 religious groups bring litigation around the ban for refugees. Just yesterday, we saw the U.S. Catholics of Bishops also challenged the suspension and disruption around our refugee program. And so it's been a heartening time despite a lot that is going on. And when we think about Quaker integrity, I'm also encouraged by the reality of the work that Quakers do on the ground, be it traditional work around sanctuary or thinking about respite and reception work, to those who are engaged in detention visitation programs or assisting those who have been recently released from detention. It shows how faith and witness can truly operate and help shape public discourse and dialogue. And a lot of what we hope to see is for that to channel as well and be resounding in the halls of Congress and in DC.
Great, thank you so much. I know that there's a lot of information we've been sharing, and I know people are really eager to have have a chance to ask some questions. So I'm going to move us into that section, and we may circle back to some of the other material as we have time. So please put your questions in the chat so that we can pick those up. And as we enter into that, this has been an intense 30 minutes or so that we've been together. And so I want to call us back into a moment of centering and worship to sort of hold all of what we've heard, all of what we are holding in this moment. And then please feel free to let us know what you would like to hear addressed. But yes, we have questions that were submitted when people registered as well. And I'm going to start with a question that several people asked, particularly about lobbying. To their members of Congress who may be, not with us, not aligned with our views, or if you live in Washington, D.C., you don't have members of Congress in quite the same way. So maybe Anika, you could speak to sort of what the value is in doing that lobbying in sort of difficult situations.
Yeah, so I'll touch the first one dealing with members who are outright resistant who are in opposition to the ask that you have, and then speak a little bit to the DC conversation. First, I just want to underscore that advocacy always matters. And it probably matters more so when you're dealing with legislators with whom we are not always aligned in how we see policies, and where we know that the legislation in which they're supporting undermines the basic humanity of individuals. And so finding an entry point is really important in those conversations. And so if someone is in a position where they can tell that their member of Congress or their staff is denying a visit or just not responding because it's specifically about the ask that is being raised, it might be getting a little creative and thinking about, is there something that is related and adjacent, but not that specific ask that can use to begin the conversation and open the door. So for example, if we're talking about the current budget package, knowing that it might impact Medicaid and SNAP, is that an entry point? And then you can also speak about how the idea of cutting that in order to fund sweeping detention and deportation is something in which you have high concern. There can be challenges to that, I will admit, particularly if you are working with the DC staffers, because they can be very specific in what portfolios they hold. But when trying to schedule visits with local staffers, that should make the conversation a little easier. Also thinking about how you build a coalition of stakeholders so they can't ignore you, right? Like that they need to hear and respond to their constituents who have something to say on a particular matter. Also taking advantage of spaces like town halls where you can be able to respectfully engage in dialogue and raise the issues that you would like the member to hear and think about differently. For those who are in DC, I would say always thinking about how you can use the representation that you do have, so with Eleanor Holmes Norton, as an ally within Congress. And so the member, while she does not always have a voting ability, does sit on committees, right? And so and is important caucuses as well. And so what are ways in which she can still be someone who helps advance conversations, and having dialogue and meetings related to that with the office can be really important. Sometimes you might have a member who isn't outright resistant, but is just apathetic to an issue, and that can feel equally as challenging. And so that a lot of that is localizing it and really getting them to appreciate why this matters for a district and for a state, and where that might feel less applicable based on where you live. Even though localize is important, sometimes a conversation matters universally, and then the aggregate is relevant for the entire country. And so this is one of those situations, and being able to uplift that is really important. Just like those who are in high East Coast metropolitan cities, their constituency might not have an immediate concern about broadband access in remote areas, but their members still promote that because they know it benefits everyone. That's the same kind of logic that we can apply in a lot of our conversations related to migration justice as well.
Great, thank you so much. Let's see. Sorting through some of the questions that came in earlier. And thank you, Vanessa, another one of our staff members who works on migration issues, for jumping into the chat and answering some questions. There was a question about engaging in civil disobedience. I know that's not FCNL's lane in terms of, you know, the strategies that we employ, but I don't know if there's any sort of in the broader movement around this issue, if either of you have any sense of sort of where something like that fits in, or if there's another organization that is leading some of those efforts that we could direct people to.
In terms of civil disobedience, there are many groups who lead in terms of protests and other sort of activism work that could be of looking at. I'm thinking about work that we have seen traditionally. I don't want to quote unquote call it as civil disobedience, but knowing that the American Friends Service Committee often engages in a lot of that local on the ground work, that would be one of the first places that I would encourage friends, big F and small f, on this call to sort of look into and to think about. But yes, agreement, and the caveat that I'm a little less connected to that work.
Yeah, and I know Brian Blackmore from AFSC is on the call and has just put some stuff in the
I
chat. So
did see
thank you, Brian.
Yes, so please feel free.
Yes, thank you for sharing resources. I also just want to mention, I know a number of people are interested in the question of you know, sanctuary spaces and their meetings or churches. And I know on Friday, Anika will be on a call specifically addressing that issue. So maybe Micah can add that link to that event, certainly in our follow-up and in the chat as well. Let's see. There was a question about, you know, I think an issue that we're all facing in having these conversations are around, you know, people who just have different information sources and a different idea of what is actually happening and what is truthful and things like that. Do you have, either one of you, any sort of advice for navigating those sorts of conversations around migration issues in particular?
Working through differing facts.
Well, just, you know, if people are met with sort of not not accepting the facts, the kinds of facts that you've laid out in this call, like, you know, disputing exactly what's happening and why and things like that.
Yeah, and in some ways, when someone is resolved in an opinion, it's always challenging to figure out how you get them to become less tethered to it. And so just outright stating things like, well, blah 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 reported this, or the truth is XYZ, usually doesn't get you anywhere. I think when you can scale back and have the conversation and find that quote unquote common ground, or see where our entry is in terms of where you might have agreement, and expanding the conversation from there, is often most useful. We run into the same issues within the advocacy and lobbying space, where there are beliefs from some members of Congress in terms of the process for unaccompanied children or whatever it may be. And we know that process to be different based on folks who actually assist unaccompanied children and are the main organizations for that. And being able to personalize the issue and bring in those stories is often what can help gather a little bit more appreciation and attention where you might not be saying eye to eye.
I would just echo that. I think also starting with listening is always a better way to lower those guards of the other and hearing what is their main concern and then seeing if the facts actually align with that, I think can be a nice way to kind of start seeing what is so important to them about this belief or this thought, and then trying to get to a place of sharing personally after listening to them personally and kind of go from there.
Great, thank you. We've had a couple questions, sort of people wanting to, or people reflecting on the moment that we're in, you know, and whether, you know, the sort of strategies and approaches that that we've taken, we FCNL are, you know, advocacy advocates, you know, whether those are still effective and, you know, functional as things sort of spiral in our federal government, and some things move very very quickly. And you know, I think that as we've talked about, you know, there are lots of different ways that people are and can and need to be acting and supporting and standing up for what they value and believe in everything from, you know, perhaps, you know, directly resisting some of these policies to supporting the immigrants who are scared and need help or need support, to the sort of lobbying work that we do. I don't know, Anika, have you found, like, what has been your experience lobbying over the past few weeks? And like, you know, do you see a need for some shifts in tactics or like um, different approaches, or is the sort of, yeah, if you can speak to that.
Yeah, I think what has been overwhelmingly clear in visits that I've had in both the House and the Senate with members on both sides of the aisle is that they put a lot of importance and credence on what they hear from their constituents. And when they aren't hearing from constituents on a certain issue, they feel like they have the cover to not do anything or to not be vocal or to not be challenging what they personally may know is wrong. And when we saw the passage of the Lake and Riley Act, which is in the namesake of a nursing student in Georgia who was murdered, and a Guatemalan migrant was found guilty of that, and the legislation passed in January, and I'll save you the details of it, but really just weaponized a horrific experience. And we saw a lot of members of Congress vote for that when their track record implies that they won it. And a lot of that, I think we can attribute to what they were and weren't hearing from their constituents on that particular bill and piece of, and what is now law, which is what taking us back to the start of the call, when we were thinking about sweeping detention and deportation. We know the public doesn't agree, and members need to hear that from their constituents. In the first or second week of the Trump administration, we saw when there was the freeze on federal assistance programs, and the halls of Congress were ringing, right? The phones could not stop, to the point the switchboard got overloaded because people were hearing from their constituents that I can't get on to these specific websites, my funding is frozen, whatever it may be. And members realized that they had to respond immediately, and the administration had to pull that back. And we cannot allow that to just be a one-off. With a lot of the challenges that's happening, there's a lot coming at us, and that's by intention and by design, right? To overwhelm us and to overflood the psyche, so to speak. but we have to be persistent and focused and intentional in our work and our advocacy, because when we do speak and when we are vocal and when we are resounding in our concern and our opposition, we know that Congress does respond.
Great, thank you. And thank you, Brian, for sharing other resources in the chat for friends. I'm seeing some good recommendations about ways of looking at the funding implications of migration and immigration.
Yeah, I just want to highlight what Brian shared is talking about creating mutual aid networks. And so kind of sharing resources with those who may need them, and thinking about ways that you could provide food, shelter, protection, clothing, other childcare resources with people in your area. And so there's a lot of work to be done, and I think I like to remind myself that there's a movement ecosystem. So there's so many people needing to do all these things. There's no right, wrong, or bad or whatever when we're all pushing towards a similar change. But some people will be out in the streets. Some people will be contacting their representatives. Some people will be in their communities with their meetings, creating mutual aid networks, helping take care of children, helping provide food. And all of it has a role in pressuring towards where we want to go. But mutual aid is great.
Great, thank you. So I wanted to ask, there's so many options right now, and there's so many, directions that people could go in, who want to be active on these issues. And I will say, we don't have this call is not set up for people to share by raising their hand. So as was shared at the beginning, we're asking people to put their questions into the chat, so that we can collect them there. But I guess both for Anika and Linnea, if people on this call, if there was like one action that they were gonna, get off this call and do, or take back to their community, what would you think would be the thing that people should do?
Yeah, I'll kick it off. So thinking about the immediate, the medium term, and the long term. For the immediate, challenging and calling on everyone to take some time and write a letter to the editor about why you are concerned and in disagreement with the current policies we're seeing to remove longstanding community members and our undocumented neighbors from the US. Our toolkit gives a lot of starter points that you can think about if you're not sure where to begin on writing an LTE, as well as guidance about how you put that together and can get that published.
Yeah, I think I will just say find a community that you want to take action with, whether that is your local meeting, whether that is FCNL, a great place, or AFSC, or a local org in your community that's doing migration relief work. Whatever it is, I think finding a community that you can feel connected to and do some sustained work in is gonna serve you long term. And we're not meant to do this work alone, and we can't. So finding wherever that is for you and plugging in.
Great, thank you. And I see a lot of people sharing in the chat ways that they're involved in different resources there. We just have a few more minutes left in our time together. And I want to turn things back to Anika, because we've spent a lot of time talking about the policies and things, but we wanted to make sure to bring in the voices of some of the people affected by these these policies as well as we close.
Yeah, so I just wanted to leave us with an excerpt from Jose Antonio Vargas, who wrote Dear America, Notes from an Undocumented Citizen. Jose is a dreamer who's now a visa holder, but an immigrants' rights activist, and who came to the US at the age of 12 from the Philippines, not knowing that he was going to be undocumented, and learned when he was 16 when trying to get his driver's license in California. And so there's a segment in his memoir that I ask us all to hold. I think of it connected to my own faith traditions. Leviticus 19 talks about loving the stranger. You know, some people might interpret that as immigrant, foreigner, but loving the stranger as a native born, loving the stranger as yourself. And so I hold that when I think about Vargas's words. He shares, I came to the realization that I refused to let a presidency scare me from my own country. I refuse to live a life of fear, defined by a government that doesn't even know why it fears what it fears. Because I am not a citizen by law or by birth, I have had to create and hold onto a different kind of citizenship. Citizenship is showing up. Citizenship is using your voice while making sure you hear other people around you. Citizenship is how you live your life.
Thank you, Anika. And I just want to thank all of you for showing up, sharing your light and your ideas and what you're doing and your resources. And I see more questions coming in that we're not going to have time to address, but I hear a lot of real interest in sort of how do our strategies change and adapt as we need to. And, you know, thank you for all of the support you're giving us and each other in the lobbying that you're doing, and the activism and the organizing and the mutual aid, in the, you know, holding in the light, and in your prayers, and in the financial support you offer to FCNL and to your friends and neighbors. And I will turn things just back to and thank you to Anika and Linnea for offering your perspectives on this work as well. And it is a challenging time to be lobbying on Capitol Hill, so we really appreciate your support in all of the ways. And then I just want to, as we close, just give Micah an opportunity to share some final resources.
Yeah, I thank you, Alicia, for welcoming me back to close out this program, the title of which is Urgent Action for Migration Rights. So these have been mentioned throughout the program, but we really want to highlight them as what folks can do right now, bringing this back to your communities, bringing this back not only your friends, but interfaith networks, people in your local districts and statewide networks. We've mentioned that we currently have a legislative ask telling Congress that mass deportation and detention is not the answer. We're really pushing to stop these inhumane policies that are being introduced, and standing up for the rights of every person in this community with no exceptions. We've mentioned the urgent action of writing LTEs. So sometimes we're doing work on getting collective and corporate statements in some districts, specifically on the protected spaces. But those sometimes take time, as we know, as friends doing this work, to come to consensus of what we're able to agree to as a community. But LTEs are something that you can do as an individual or as a community to get that information and your stance out to your community, which is what's really needed now to bring this information home to not only our congresspeople but to our communities, that what's happening is not acceptable. We've mentioned the storytelling project as well, which is something a little bit more long-term, but to really continue to deepen and broaden the narrative of what migrant communities bring to this country and bring to our individual communities across the country, not just in one or two dimensionals, but in all of the ways that these wonderful people enhance the United States. We also know that Friends are really interested in a lot of direct action, which is something that we at FCNL have mentioned do not focus the majority of our work on. We're focusing on lobbying and the systemic change, but Brian has been a great resource, and we have collected some in addition to those, which is the Know Your Rights Deportation Defense Resources, which can be found at fcnl.org/KYR, Know Your Rights. And if you're on that strain, really looking for what to do with your church, if you're thinking about being a sanctuary location, and how to faithfully resist what is happening, there's the program that Anika will be on Friday at 12 p.m. Eastern time, where she'll be talking with other faith leaders about some of this work and about how you as a faith community can stand up against what is happening in your physical locations. It's one of the biggest gifts that we have to offer those in our community. I want to say thank you all so much for coming again to this Quaker Changemaker event on migration justice. Immense gratitude to Anika and Linnea and Alicia for walking us through all of the information. And additionally, as always, if you have any more questions for us or anyone here, you can reach us at quakers@fcnl.org and we will get back to you. But we hope you have a great night. And we hope to see you at our next Quaker Changemaker event in April.
Thank you all. Be well. Thank you for all you're doing.